Hey guys, Amy from Colorado Mountain Living here, and today I want to show you how to make a worm bin. It's a project I've been wanting to do for a while, and I just found a place where I can get the worms for the worm bin. But I'm going to show you how to make one using kitty litter containers. Now that we're living in Colorado, our cat has to be an indoor cat all the way. So that means litter box, litter, all of that mess. So it's like we're always coming up with trying to think of ways to reuse all these big kitty litter containers. And one thing I read you could do is make worm bins out of it. So a worm bin is basically a way you can compost with worms instead of using a traditional compost pile outside. So it's a great alternative for people that are living in a place where they can't have an outdoor bin, or you've got an animal issue with like bears or coyotes or raccoons that are always getting into your compost. This stays indoors. So the worms will eat up all of your kitchen scraps, and then they'll produce worm castings, fancy word for worm poop, but it's a type of fertilizer that's really good for the soil. And you also get another byproduct called compost tea. It's basically all of the liquid that comes out of the environment that the worms are living in, and you can dilute that and actually apply it directly to plants in your garden, and it's an excellent fertilizer, really high in nitrogen, and you don't have to pay for it if you can do it yourself. I was in Costco earlier this week and saw that they were selling bags of worm castings for $40. So take your kitchen scraps, throw them in a bucket with some worms, and you've got yours for free. So you need 2 buckets to get started. I'm going to use this bucket as my bottom bucket because the lid on this one actually comes all the way off. This bucket, the lid sort of comes halfway off, so I'm going to use this as my top bucket. And what's going to happen is I'm going to drill holes in the bottom, and then I could nest it right into this one, and that's going to be my system. The reason why you need 2 buckets is because when you put your worms and your food in the top, you need a place for all the juice to drain out, and that's going to get caught up in the bottom bucket. So you don't want holes in your bottom bucket. You leave that one with no holes. You put your holes in your top bucket, and you put some around the top for some aeration so the worms can get a little bit more oxygen into the system and help break down those food scraps. So one tool that you're going to need, a drill with a 1/8 inch bit. And you're just going to go ahead and drill a bunch of holes. I've got my helper here. Okay, you're going to supervise. The easiest way to do it is just flip the bucket upside down. Now the bottom of this bucket, you can see it's got some ridges. I'm going to focus on putting the drainage holes around the edges where it's a little bit lower. I think the water is going to collect there rather than up on the upper ridges. So I'm just going to fill my bucket in those sections with the holes. I'll probably put a couple dozen holes in there. So we got our holes drilled around the bottom. Now I'm going to drill some around this top ridge here so they get a little bit of aeration. That's all. That's as easy as that. So there's one thing left to do, and that is to prep your bucket for the worms. I can't just go to the store, get a pound of worms, throw them in the bucket. You need to make a little bed for them. So one thing that you do is you can take newspaper, or we had some little brown paper here. It's a little bit moist, so it's kind of soft and everything. It gives them something. The paper actually gives the kitchen scraps something to kind of catch all the juices and stuff. So what you don't want in a worm bin is for the whole environment to become too soggy. You know, if it turns into a soup, that's not really good for the worm's health. So you need a good balance of dry bedding and your kitchen scraps. So as you're putting in food scraps, every once in a while you want to put in some shredded newspaper. You could put in some leaves if you want, but you know, it's a great way to use up old junk mail. So I'm going to put in these paper scraps. It's not that much, and you know, they're not soaking wet. They're just damp. I'm going to give them a little bit of food to get started. What I've got in here is some garlic papers. I've got some leftover apples and apricots that have been soaking in my sourdough bread starter. If you haven't seen that recipe and how I make sourdough bread and how I make the starter from fruit, that's what these are from. I'll post a link to that. And then I've got a little bit of some orange peels that were going bad and like one little piece of broccoli. So it's a little bowl of food for them. I'm going to dump it into the bucket. There's a little bit of coffee grounds in there. So I'm going to dump this in. The next step is to get the worms. So I just picked these up this afternoon. In fact, that's why I waited to make a worm bin, because I wasn't sure where to get these worms. These are called red wigglers, and they're a specific kind of worm that's really suited for this task. That's the kind of worms you want to get, red wigglers. I'll just release them gently. Kind of throw them down there at the bottom. So there they are. The worms are in there with the food. And what you can do, you leave the lid on. I'm going to leave this in the pantry for now, next to the garbage can, because it's too cold to leave them on the sun porch here overnight. It's just a little bit too freezing, and I don't want to freeze my worms out. So whenever I get my food scraps, I can kind of chuck them in here. And I don't want it to get too soupy and wet. So what's going to happen, some of the liquid's going to drain, but I'm going to keep throwing in some shredded up paper, and onion skins are really good. Garlic skins, those are some dry elements that the worms can kind of be in, so they don't get drowned out with too much moisture and food scraps. Because you can overdo it with the food if you just keep loading and loading pounds and pounds of food on. The worms need a chance to reproduce and make more worms, and eventually this bin's going to be too small for them. So I could separate it into 2 worm bins. Anyway, simple way to make a worm bin: recycling. Kitty litter buckets, and you can have your own indoor composting year-round, pest-free. Don't have to worry about any animals getting into this. Closed system, producing worm castings for your garden and liquefied worm compost tea. So enjoy. If this was a handy tip for you and you're thinking about worm composting, go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to our channel.